Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to Information Age. This is a really cool place in the Science Museum here on level 2. We're surrounded by inspiration and amazing achievements over the years. This behind me is a web of copper and wood. It's actually an aerial from Rugby radio station that's been brought down from the Midlands. So as people come in, the first session here today on Information Age is the big question really, and I think we touched on it earlier. How do we fund fusion? Now, I'm joined by Robert Trezona, who's the head of Cleantech at IP Group, who are the first and largest investors in First Light Fusion. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and welcome audience. Good afternoon. I'm joined by a couple of other investors, and hopefully we'll go through some of the thinking behind funding this technology area, both from the private sector perspective and also the public sector. So I think we have both speakers here, so allow me to introduce, first of all, Carly Anderson, who's currently at Prelude Ventures, but previously was at Prime Movers Lab and has invested in both Commonwealth Fusion Systems and Focused Energy. And we also have Malcolm Handley, who has set up a fusion fund called Strong Atomics. And Malcolm has a background in the technology sector. And one of the themes that we've been seeing in clean energy is people coming out of companies like Google, where Malcolm was one of the early employees, and Asana, and joining this area of clean energy. We're going to split the session into 3 segments. So we're going to start talking about the private sector investment case. Then we'll talk about the role of government funding. Obviously, we're hosted today by UKAEA, who've been instrumental in the ecosystem, certainly in this country. And then we'll finish with some questions and reflections on the wider context of fusion energy and how it affects the funding availability. We have a live audience here of about 40, 50 people. We're going to create opportunities for you to ask us questions as we go through the session. If you have a question, please put your hand up, and we have roving mics. So please use a mic to answer a question, because we also have a large virtual audience, and they won't hear your question unless you speak into the mic. And at the end of the session, if we have questions from the virtual audience, Stuart is going to corral those, and we'll make sure we have some time to answer questions from the virtual audience as well. So let's get cracking. We'll start off in that first section, which is around private sector investment. And this first question to Malcolm. And first of all, I may just thank Malcolm and Carly. They're both based on the West Coast. And so this is 4 a.m., I think, at the moment in California time. So people talk about investors in fusion being very committed, and both Malcolm and Carly demonstrating that today. So really thank you both for making time for us so early in the morning, California time. So a question, first of all, to Malcolm. You've set up a fund dedicated to backing fusion startups. Why is now a good time to be backing these companies?
Well, so I started this back in 2017, and the realization that I came to was that there was quite a lot of government money going to fusion, but it was going to not even fusion companies. It was primarily going to 2 main research projects. And there was also some private money going to fusion, but there was this whole new generation of fusion companies that were really struggling to get any private money or much government money. And I felt that they were doing some of the most promising work. And so for a very small amount of money, one could make a transformative difference to those companies. And I hoped to the future of fusion and clean energy by investing in them. So I got started with a $4 million fund supporting 4 companies. And I think it was transformative in the sense that one of those investments enabled a company, Zap, to hit its milestones in a way that it was not likely to before, which then went on to support RPE in doing 2 more fusion programs. So basically, it was early money that was able to very cheaply have a large impact on fusion.
Oh, thanks, Malcolm. And that's actually been our experience with First Light. In the early days, we tried to get some funding from technology transfer organizations in the UK, and we really struggled with making the case for something so early stage. Carly, at Prime Movers Lab, you've invested in both Commonwealth Fusion and Focused Energy. I'm sure the audience will be really interested to understand how you as a private sector venture investor make an investment case for companies like that. Can you just give us a few highlights on how you make that case?
Absolutely. So there's a whole spectrum of private capital and return timelines. Prime Movers Lab has a 10-year fund return timeline. How do you make that work with Fusion? And I'll say that with both Commonwealth Fusion Systems and with Focused Energy, we saw very real technology advancements and developments that could be spun out, and that would be adding value outside the Fusion ecosystem even. So that's piece one, but maybe the more important piece, especially around Commonwealth, is there is a very exciting story around a fusion company getting to net energy gain. And what does that Kitty Hawk moment look like? And is there a potential for that company to then raise on a public market on the back of such an event? And so with both Commonwealth and with some of the other companies that have been just driving ahead towards Q equals greater than 1 over the last couple of years, that is a plausible story as well.
And I think one of the questions that people asked us from UKAEA to cover was, as we're starting to see, and I'm sure you are too, further startups coming through. We've had several come in this year approaching us for funding. In addition to sort of things like a route to gain, what are the characteristics, particularly for the new ideas, that you'd be looking at for a fusion startup to be fundable? I'll let either of you answer.
Okay. I'm looking for a credible team. That means credible scientifically as well as on all the normal team dynamics, management, execution skills. A credible team working on credible peer-reviewed science, applying some sort of disruptive innovation or insight from the outside, such as Commonwealth sterilization. The tokamaks are well studied, very mature actually by this point, but were hobbled by impractical designs, and that if you bring along high temperature superconducting magnets, then you can make them smaller and so cheaper, and you can also make them maintainable. So credible team working on credible science with some sort of insight that unlocks a lot of promise that had seemed to be locked up before.
Yeah, that's great. Anything else, Carly?
I was strategically letting Malcolm go first because all of the things he said, and also the ability to show what that cost reduction curve might look like, right? So there's a lot of tailwinds in additive manufacturing, in different materials, in simulation capabilities, and especially with some of the additional grants that have become available in the last couple of years, we want to see how fusion is going to be not just possible, but competitive economically.
Yeah.
And another thing is, 3-ish years ago, a company could get funded just with what we've just said. Now that there are quite a few established, well-funded fusion companies, the bar is a lot higher. You can't just come along and say, look, here's this technology and it works, and so give us money and we're going to develop it. You have to be able to explain why you're differentiated from those existing funded companies.
Yeah.
So that means a much stronger focus on we're going to be a lot simpler, and that translates to being cheaper, or we're going to be smaller, or some other differentiation.
Yeah, no, we see that same requirement for differentiation. It's interesting, there's sort of a Venn diagram of sort of scientifically plausible ideas and distinctive ideas. And I think one of the things that we've been really pleased to see in this community is all these startups look at the literature, they work with the established government labs and universities. And we're not talking about low energy nuclear reactions, cold fusion. We're talking about conventional physics concepts, and really how do we do this in an engineering context. And that's been fabulous to see. So I think it's clear that there's a lot of thinking from the private sector investors on how to make an investment case. Another question I frequently get asked is around timescales. And we had it this morning, the old 30 years and always will be came out. Clearly, these are longer timescale companies. And so maybe my first question on this is to Malcolm, who obviously running a fund with multiple fusion projects. How do you think about the timescales of your various positions and how you might deliver cash back to your backers?
So I think the point that Carly made can be made many times over. You don't need to get to a plant on the grid within the lifetime of a fund in order for the fund to do well. If you look at Commonwealth already, just as I think the primary example of this, there are many, many increases in value along the way. You can often cash out some of your position at those milestones. Even if that doesn't happen, if they go public, you can definitely do that. And I think going, at least for the first few companies that get to gain greater than 1, I think they're extremely likely to go public soon after that, because they can, but also because they're going to want access to all the money that comes with that. And there are a lot of companies that I think are credibly aiming to get to energy gain greater than 1 in the next 3.5 years by the end of 2025. So I spend a lot of time thinking about, will fusion come soon enough to make a difference for climate change? When will it get onto the grid? How will we fund the first plant? How will we fund the next 10 plants? What will the cost curve look like? I don't spend any time thinking about how we're going to get returns soon enough for VC investors. I think if everything else happens in a way that's meaningful for energy and for climate change, the returns are going to take care of themselves.
Oh, thanks, Malcolm. Maybe final question for this session, and you've alluded to it both a couple of times. We maybe see a couple of different cohorts of startups, and Malcolm has just mentioned that there are several now that are funded sufficiently to get to a gain demonstration, but there are also new companies coming through, and you could potentially see those as 2 distinct cohorts of companies. So maybe final question in this part of the discussion to Carly. How do you think about that sort of second generation of companies? What should they be doing? Does it affect the timescales in terms of value creation that Malcolm mentioned?
Yeah, I think to double click on something he said earlier, there really is a higher bar. And that's both being a little bit later and in the face of the market conditions today, which we have to recognize that things are very different than they looked a year ago, at least in the venture markets. In terms of showing that they are nimble, that they are agile, that they are resource magnets, that they can come up with ways to make progress on multiple lines. We're seeing a lot of interesting stuff in supply chain development. So not even at the not just at the fusion company level, but also along the supply chains. There may be ways to work together and leverage some other funding sources in advanced manufacturing or some of the other areas that are getting both public and private attention right now. So in terms of what those companies, that second wave of companies should be doing, it's continuing to get out there and publish and be open and collaborate. It is demonstrating that you're differentiated and you have a path to low costs. And there's demonstrating that you really have that exceptional team that not only has the technical and execution ability, but the ability to be creative, be scrappy, do what it's going to take to, starting from kind of the far position, work your way to the front of the pack, or at least, yeah.
Great, thanks, Carly.
Group it.
Just to add to that a little bit, I think the first wave of fusion companies that got funded had to have very low science risk, but people were okay with some engineering risk. And now, as investors have wrapped our heads around fusion a bit more than we had 5 years ago, and as we're looking for these more differentiated companies, I think there's some greater tolerance of science risk than there was before.
Yeah, no, we're seeing that, and it was alluded to at the first panel today, where there's some really amazing concepts coming out. So now we're going to sort of open up to the live audience here for the first section of questions. We'll take a couple of questions if there are any, and we'll do this again later on after we've discussed the public sector and the broader context. So if you have a question now, please put your hand up and we'll get you a microphone and you can put a question to the panelists on this first section on the private sector investment case. Please. Just see if we can get you a microphone so the virtual audience can hear you. Thanks.
Hi, Jane Hotchkiss. Hi, Carly. Hi, Malcolm.
Hi.
It's funny to fly all this way and see my friends, which also tells us that the world is too small for right now and in the investment side. My question to the two of you and to many others is not surprising, which is, as an NGO, I want to know where the private philanthropy and the private foundations are to support the education and the outreach and the kinds of things that Energy for the Common Good does and will have to be done to pave the way for fusion to be successful on a timeline that, as Malcolm said, makes a difference.
Over to you guys. Did you hear the question okay?
No, we did. I think
Yep.
we're each waiting for the other one to
Yeah.
answer. Ben, you should get on stage.
Yeah.
You should tell us about this.
I would like to think that this is that there's a little bit of a lag in just the public awareness around fusion. I think the Commonwealth round, a lot of the exceptional progress at JET, the NIF result, I think the White House event in the US, similar conferences and events in Europe. I think we're at the stage where we're still creating public awareness, and it may take some time for that to trickle into the NGO world. I would love to actually hear your opinion on that, because I know you're much more knowledgeable in that space than us bean counters over here. But I would like to see more of that, and I think that's a great place for public and private sector to work together.
To maybe respond from our perspective, so we think a lot about the commercialization and cost down, and particularly around where energy demand is going to be in the 2030s and 40s. And India was alluded to earlier in the session. If you look at their power system, which is largely very, very cheap coal at the moment, assuming we're successful and we have commercially viable fusion, for countries like India, there is a case to use models from development finance to make rollout of those plants more attractive. There's a huge opportunity around skills development as well. So we invest in a wide range of clean energy technologies. So we've done solar power in Africa, we've done wind, we're doing battery storage. And what you find is that the demand in emerging economies is there. People are thinking around electrification. So some of these emerging economies haven't had a fossil fuel infrastructure, and there's a huge opportunity to start with electrification and go from that direction. So, as you think about where all these fusion power plants are going to be, a lot of it is Asia, so Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa is another location. And I think a good place for philanthropic funding to look at is the deployment. There's actually a lot of funding available for the really exciting innovation piece, but then to cross the valley of debt in terms of getting the costs down, particularly in some of those economies, I think support from philanthropic sector could be really valuable. Maybe we'll do one more question from the audience.
Hi, it's Malcolm Parry from Hogan Lovells. So I'm a lawyer focusing on getting first-of-a-kind projects off the ground. And Carly, I'm going to ask sort of a similar question to the one I think you didn't quite get a chance to answer. But given the investment case, what's the sort of balance that you take between monetization of IP and ideas along the road and the essential collaboration that we all need to ensure that we sort of, for the greater good, achieve the end goal that we're all striving for, climate change and energy transition? How do you view that balance with your companies and your investees?
I think this actually is a great question. I think the answer will be different for different investors. I see fusion as an area where there honestly is a lot of not just trade secret, right, but in skill development within a team that is very hard to replicate, right? So I'm actually a little bit less concerned about having an ironclad IP around your reactor technology, because it's going to be really hard for someone else to build that reactor, even if they had the exact manual. I am very much more concerned about how are you going to be able to make these things cheaply enough to be meaningful in terms of penetration into the electric grid. So that is just me. It does need to be different. It needs to be something that a company can develop expertise around. but I'm a little bit less concerned around, patenting every nozzle and gasket in the plant, and more on manufacturability.
Great. Thanks, Carly.
Hopefully that was part of what you asked.
So let's move on to the second section. So the session today is around funding generally, not just the private sector. And although this panel is made up of private venture capital investors, we all work very closely with governments and government agencies as part of the work we do in Fusion. And I think, thinking back 10 years ago when we were sitting around the table, having just invested in First Light, we looked at the history of civil nuclear in this country and other parts of the Western world, and it became very obvious that this technology would need close collaboration with governments. You're connecting large thermal assets to the grid, you've got the various hazards and other sort of controlled substances that you'd be working with, such as tritium. And so from the outset, we're always going to work with the UK government and with organisations like UKAEA. So I think that's a critical part, and one thing that we've been really sort of pleased to see is the partnership that continues to exist between the new private sector activities and the public estate. So maybe our first question on this to Malcolm. We understand you've worked extensively with the very successful ARPA-E program in the US. How has that helped you in terms of thinking through the investment cases? And also, going forward, there's now $5 billion of private sector investment has gone into these companies. What's the role going forward for funding agencies like ARPA-E?
Sure. Yeah, so I worked at ARPA-E in the Fusion program there for a year doing tech-to-market work. So basically saying, assuming that the science that we're funding works, what else can we be doing and can we be encouraging these companies to do to increase their chance at success beyond the funded science work? Honestly, the one thing I learned from that is that doing technical diligence on these companies is really hard. I'd look at applications for funding from these companies, and I'd think, like, these people are promising a suspicious amount of stuff, but I know that these are like serious, respected people. It looks like a strong application to me. And then I talk to the more technical people, and I would discover all the holes in these things, and oftentimes they wouldn't get funded. So it was a humbling experience, and I guess it taught me to stay in my lane in a way and lean on other people for the technical diligence. But ARPA-E's involvement in Fusion really cannot be overstated. They were the funding agency that took anything other than extremely mainstream fusion from being a completely ignored desert, basically, to being this thriving ecosystem that we have today. And I think Pat McGrath and Scott Shue and the agency in general deserve a ton of credit for that. There was a long time where companies were spinning out of institutions way sooner than they should have, because there was no path to government funding. The only path was private funding, even though private funding was also a desert. And ARPA-E is basically the thing that changed that in America. Going forward, I think there's still a room for ARPA-E's funding, but Fusion's capital needs, at least for the successful, more mature companies, have gotten larger than ARPA-E can provide. And so we're seeing this shift from project awards in the realm of $5-ish million through to these public-private partnerships where the DOE says, now, more like we did with the space program, we're going to negotiate a milestone of a roadmap of milestones and payments with different companies, and then give them much more significant amounts of money as they hit that. And this is a way for companies to scale up towards building a plant in a way that could never be supported by the smaller grants. So we're shifting from smaller grants supporting early stage research to larger awards paying for research that has already been privately funded and successful. And now you're just compensating the companies so that they can go on to the next work using their private money more efficiently.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. And I think that transition from sort of the curiosity-driven science that we've seen in this country, in the UK, to more infrastructure support is an important one for this country as well. Carly, both of your investments have sort of effectively spun out of some of the world-leading government-backed labs. Could you just talk us through the importance of that sort of foundational work in creating those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to the extremely strong technical background, and like Malcolm alluded to, the ability to either at a national lab or within a university, just do a ton of basic technical work to set that base level and prove out the concept. That's hugely important. Just the facilities alone, that's millions of dollars or billions in the case of the National Ignition Facility and the inertial confinement fusion approach that Focused Energy is pursuing, something similar. Like that wouldn't be possible at the $5 million funding scale. The other thing that those national labs and universities create is teams of technical people who have already worked together and are ready to step off and continue working together on the private sector. And we've heard at other points in this conference about the need for workforce development, but still seeding those companies with a kernel of technical folks who have already worked on the concept and worked together and are ready to go on day one is huge for making rapid progress along the roadmap.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. And certainly in the case of our investments in First Light, the collaboration with UKAEA has been incredibly valuable. So things like how do you create the tritium, remote handling, shielding, there's a huge amount of existing expertise that First Light's been able to tap into, and not least having UKAEA come and validate the fusion sort of demonstration earlier this year. Okay, so I think it's the second opportunity.
And I should like to give one more plug for the amazing people at the national labs and some of the university labs, because they really have launched a lot of these technologies and don't get a lot of the credit often on some of these industry panels. So. Yeah,
here. Okay, so this is the second opportunity to open up to questions from the live audience here. So if anyone has questions around the public sector funding, the government support for fusion, for the panel, please ask them now, and please wait for a microphone so everyone can hear you in the virtual audience. Yes, over in the back there.
Hi, Chris Carlton from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. I wondered if you could comment more on the what you briefly alluded to the value of the curiosity-driven science and the government support for that, and how that leads into that pull-through that you were briefly discussing.
Sure, so thanks. So that question, so from someone from the Research Council, which is the UK research funding body, and the question really is around the importance of curiosity-driven research in the field. Carly, Malcolm, any reflections on the importance of pure science in what you're doing?
Oh, all of these companies, I think, started as just research, not just in the sense of disparaging it, but research that was so early that you couldn't say, I am trying to solve an energy problem. This was science seeing where science takes you. And then when you find something, you develop it more, and then it eventually becomes a company. And I think H-mode in tokamaks is an example of that. I don't know that I think no one was able to foresee this more efficient way that you could operate a tokamak. They stumbled across it while they were doing science, and now it's the thing that so many tokamak companies rely on. So this starts as science, and then it progresses and progresses, and eventually becomes a company.
Yeah. No, thanks, Malcolm. Other questions? Sorry, Carly.
It's incredibly. Oh, just briefly, I'd like to, especially for like things like diagnostics, right? Like private capital likes to fund laser-focused efforts towards milestones. And there are places where you need a tool to measure a thing, or you need a material to be able to do an experiment. And that type of thing, private capital is very bad at funding. And so there is a real need for, both directed public funding programs and for curiosity-driven, what else even could be out there that we're not thinking about that will eventually enable like a huge improvement in cost of performance.
Yeah. Thanks, Carly.
Yeah.
So do you have other questions from the audience? Yes, I think it's Ian in the back there.
Thank you. Ian Chapman from UKAEA. I'd like to sort of ask a question which combines these two bits about the sort of VC money and then the government backing. I can well imagine that companies can get to gain experiments or burn experiments on the back of VC money, maybe raising a few billions to do that. If I take us forward to the next phase of actually building prototype power plants, I know a little bit about fusion, and I really struggle to imagine a power plant being built for less than many billions, probably upwards of 10 billion. And do you really think that we can raise that money through venture capitalists? What is the role of government in underpinning those things? I mean, how are we going to go to that phase? How are we going to fund that phase?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Great question. So the big money for the first of a kind and future plants. Carly, Malcolm, what are your thoughts on where that capital comes from?
You want to go first, Carly?
Sure, I'll go first, and you can talk about all the programs I forget. I think Malcolm mentioned the COTS program already. In the U.S., the Advanced Reactor Development Program on the fission side of things has, I think, been really already catalytic in terms of showing how there might be a path to getting new advanced reactors built. And so that is a government cost share program where some of the money, maybe 50% is coming from the government. Some of that money is coming from the utility or energy company that hopes to deploy that technology. And I'll mention as a side trend, we've seen much more interest from corporates getting into all stages of venture, not just in the fusion sector, in the past 2 years. And then again, some of that coming from the company itself. But if you had to raise billions of equity on venture capital, that math just doesn't work in terms of company valuations, in my opinion.
I agree. Malcolm?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is not going to be VC funded when you get out to that stage of development. It's going to be a mix of other forms of private funding, hopefully project finance for some of it, and then government funding as well. I think that these milestone programs cannot be overweighted in their significance. They provide a way to balance public sector funding and private sector funding in a way that leverages the strengths of both. So often a problem with government funding, especially for larger projects, is that governments are left picking winners, and then the governments are afraid to take on the risk of picking those winners, because if they pick losers, they get a lot of blowback. When you do it as milestone payments, the private sector has to pick the companies to bet on, provide the money up front, and then only when they succeed at doing something do they get the money back. And this, I think, is a very nice blending of the private sector's willingness to take risks and willingness to pick winners, and the government's ability to then provide money when success has been achieved. So I think that this is a model that we're going to see quite a lot more of as we go from fusion as an R&D problem to building demonstration plants and then real plants.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. And I think from our perspective, we agree that these billions they're not venture equity. There's an essential role for government. And actually, looping back to the first session of the day today, the need for an additional dispatchable power source to complement renewables is coming into focus. And whether you're a government who can spend billions or a large energy corporate who also have investment budgets in the billions, that's going to become very clear in the next 5 to 10 years, we believe. So it's not us venture capitalists, it's other larger players in the energy space with more of a strategic motivation. I'll move on to the final session now, which is around the broader context. Actually teed up very nicely by a question from the virtual audience from Matt Nolan. So thanks, Matt, for your question. So Matt's question is, has the recent highlighting of the energy crisis, so the current high prices that we're seeing, diverted funds away from fusion towards, for example, next generation nuclear SMRs, or have the panel seen the energy crisis as ultimately good news for fusion? So what have you been experiencing, Carly and Malcolm, in terms of the recent developments with the energy crisis?
I haven't seen a change. I think fusion funding was going gangbusters even before the Ukraine situation. And since then, we've seen a downturn in so much of the market, and fusion has just kept on going in a way that I find relieving and thrilling. And so I think it's a combination of the fact that people recognize that climate change isn't going away, even though there's a risk of war at the moment. Well, is a war and a risk of a bigger war. And maybe the energy instability is helping there. It's very hard for me to finger particular causes.
Carly, any change that you've noticed?
Yeah, agree. The situation is very convoluted, and the markets are down because of the conflict around energy in part, and fusion has not gone down with the market because it helps to address that need. I am seeing more interest from people with strategic interests around energy security in funding fusion to a small extent.
And to sort of give a European or UK perspective, what we've observed is a lot more emphasis being played towards brackets nuclear as dispatchable, in which fusion is now included. We spend a lot of time not trying to describe our fusion investment as nuclear, but I think it's being, by policymakers, bracketed into the bucket. And what we're seeing is, with costs of fission in the Western world rising, if you look at Lazard data, there's a lot of interest in whether fusion can break what seems to be a cycle in the West where the cost of fission plant keep going up and people aren't sure about SMRs. So certainly our experience talking to government stakeholders and some of these big corporates is the energy crisis means energy security, and of course not having to rely on a uranium fuel supply chain has created more interest in fusion. And First Light's going out on a fundraise right now. We're hearing that from investors. Maybe a final topic before we finish, it was alluded to earlier, but it's very important for VC funders, is around talent. We talked a bit about some of the incredible people who work in the government labs. But really to Malcolm and Carly, as these investments that you're making scale, is there a talent dimension to your planning for the companies, to the investment case, and really maybe as a risk in terms of making sure there are people with enough of the relevant skills?
Okay. One talent dimension is that fusion was a backwater for a long time. And so we've had this population of people doing fusion at universities and labs who were just getting older, and the young people weren't really coming in behind them. And so we got very lucky that fusion had its renaissance when it did, because if we'd waited another 10 years, these people would all have retired and died. So we now have another wave of people coming through who in time to learn from them. And when you go to fusion conferences, you really see this bimodal distribution. You get the young people and the old people, and very few people my age. That said, I think that we seem to have enough people coming through. As far as I can tell, we have enough plasma physicists, we have enough people doing that kind of thing. As you scale the company, I'm not sure that you need a whole ton more plasma physicists. You need mechanical engineers and chemical engineers, nuclear engineers and electrical engineers, and those people do exist, and I think those people are starting to find their way to fusion. And rocket engineers find their way as well and are able to do a lot of useful stuff. So I think that the market is working and that fusion is getting the people that it needs, but it's a weakly held proposition at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Malcolm. So I think we'll sort of finish up that session here and just finish off in the last minute. Any final question from the audience here? If not, I've got a question from Diana McCracken from the virtual audience, which is another dimension on this. And so Diana asks, how can a non-high net worth get involved in fusion investments? Are there any crowdfunding companies that can be recommended? Carly, Malcolm, I'm sure investing in your fund would be a great opportunity, but any other thoughts on how individuals get exposure to these companies pre-IPOs that we talked about earlier?
So
Okay,
I think number one, it's
go
important
ahead.
to say we're not allowed to give investment advice. I think the SEC requires that.
Yeah.
But I think making I think I'm very curious about, is there space for more of a publicly accessible index fund? I think that's a topic that is being discussed.
Yeah.
And it's great to hear that there may be potentially more interest in that. Malcolm, look like you have things to add.
Yeah, so at least one little fusion company has done a crowdfunding campaign that was much less successful than I'd hoped, but that was a real official crowdfunding campaign that non-accredited investors could invest in. If you're an accredited investor, but you're just not at the sort of crazy level of wealth required to invest in these things directly, there's a fund called Nucleation Capital that is a rolling fund on Angel List that I think you can put fairly small amounts of money into on a quarterly basis. You still have to be accredited, but if you're that, then you can invest, and that's totally a way to invest in fission and fusion companies going forward.
Thanks, Malcolm. And just as a final comment, I'll make my usual shout out to the enterprise investment.
Carly wants to say one.
Sorry, Carly, go.
I think you could invest in, there are some public companies that are investing in fusion and some maybe less so. And there are supply chain, companies that are very relevant to fusion supply chains that are public as well. So just another thought if you wanted to create your own type of index.
Great. ENI and others who've backed fusion. So with that, I'd like to thank our two panelists from California again. Thank you so much for being up early in the morning and giving some really thoughtful answers to these questions. That was the last question, and thank you to the audience, both the virtual and live audience, for a really engaged discussion on this topic. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I think we're wrapping up here.